During the school excursion for Nagaoka High School, Rita and her friends Naomi and Erina finally had a chance to jump in the lake for a swim. They were the only three going in as the other students were tired after a long hike and chose to relax on the shore. They splashed around and they ventured to the farther side of the lake, even though they were told not to. As they got out, the girls were talking about the most popular boy in class, Tomoharu. Naomi was explaining how great he was at baseball, when she stopped dead in her tracks and let out an eardrum shattering scream. Hiru! Naomi shouted in Japanese. Rita was the most confused. Lunch? Erina looked like maybe she understood, but before Rita could ask her, Naomi turned around and it became obvious what was happening. The girls quickly rushed to help their friend. Erina ripped it off her and quickly threw it to the ground. The large, blood-sucking leech moved slowly in the wet mud, its dark, slimy skin glistening in the afternoon sun. Once they had returned to the other side, the teacher, Mr. Ito, promptly came over and scolded them for swimming too far and for making an unnecessary commotion. Later, he fished out 3 leeches and put 1 in each jar for the girls to take home. They needed to get used to them and learn there were bigger problems in the world to be concerned about than simple parasites. And the girls were quiet for the remainder of the day. That night, the girls were back to being chatty and turned to other things that creeped them out as they sat in front of the fire, huddled in their social circle. The girls were all screeching and giggling just after a scary story that Erina had told. Naomi got serious and looked at the other girls. "Have you ever had kanashibari?" she said, looking at Rita. Erina was already nodding. Rita responded slowly, "Kanashi? Sad?" Naomi shook her head and explained, "You wake up and you can't move. What do you call it?" A boy nearby, Tomoharu, was listening in and piped up, "Sleep paralysis," he said. Rita had never heard of it and doubted it really happened, but said, "That sounds creepy." Naomi insisted, "It's real. It happened to me last winter. I couldn't move for about an hour." Tomoharu then chimed in, "Are you sure it wasn't during Mr. Kitaki's history class?" They all laughed, except for Naomi, who under her breath replied with, "No, it was real and terrifying." The following week they were back at school, but Erina was missing from class. Naomi and Rita had no idea where she was. They kept looking around expecting her to show up, but they had a bad feeling. Near the end of the day, the principal came in and pulled the teacher aside where they talked in small voices, sometimes looking over at the girls, and the girls started to worry. After class was over, the teacher asked the girls to stay behind and talk to him. He started asking them what they knew about what happened with Erina since last week's camp. They had no idea, and after a while, the teacher sighed and told them they could go. They left the room, but soon Naomi remembered that she had forgotten her school bag and rushed back to the classroom. The teacher and the principal were talking, so she stopped near the door. The principal was saying, "We don't know where she disappeared to. No one does. I can't understand it." The teacher replied, "Her friends were totally fine and they have no idea." There was a pause, then, "No one has seen her since last night," the principal nodded. Naomi was frozen. "Missing?" She wanted to scream, but her throat was suddenly dry and she couldn't make any noises. Her breath was becoming short, and she felt she had to get out of there. She ran all the way home, and when she got home, she was restless with sick and worry. She stared at the leech in the jar on her table. Mr. Musashi had been right. There were bigger things in the world to be worried about, and she realized she no longer feared the repulsive leech. She felt she should let Rita know what she overheard at school, but before she could, she drifted off to sleep. It wasn't long before she suddenly woke up to the sound of the leech flailing around in the jar on the table in her room. It seemed to be growing larger and wanted out. A hot flush of anger washed over her and she dumped the leech out onto the floor, screamed and then stomped on it. She could then hear the door to her parents' room open. She had some explaining to do. Similarly, at Rita's house, the Leech she had brought home from camp was also having a restless night. Rita looked at the shadows dancing on the ceiling when she realized what had woken her. The Leech in the glass jar that she had been given was flailing around wildly and smacking against the glass wall of the jar. She had never heard of such behavior and went to move to turn on the light. But she couldn't move. She couldn't move at all. The sound of the Leech tapping on the glass added to her stress of being paralyzed in place. She put forth a great effort to sit up, but still lay there helplessly. Her eyes darted to the jar, and the Leech looked like it had doubled in size as the glass had begun to crack. Now she was trying with all her might to flail and move, but only one finger managed to move and tap on the bed. The jar had shattered to pieces, and the now even larger leech-like creature seemed to be moving towards her. She tried with all her might to scream, but only managed a small "help." The Leech was slithering up the side of her bed and was starting to touch her leg. She tried to recoil, but to no avail. Was this from within her, or was the leech-like creature causing the paralysis? Her fingers tapped on the bed more rapidly and earnestly. Now there was a banging on the window, but she didn't want to look. Were more of these creatures coming? The Leech was even larger now, and had moved all the way up her leg and was inching towards her stomach. She could feel its dry yet slimy flesh pressing against her, hungrily searching for somewhere to suck out her blood. There was the sound of a window smashing, and she knew she was done for. She finally was able to scream. The creature visibly reacted to the sound, and did it shrink a little too? She started again trying to move, and it felt like for a second she was going to, but the paralysis took hold again as the creature started moving further up and over her bosom. Another scream came from the window side, and this time Rita gained her movement again. She whipped her head over to the window and found that Naomi was standing there looking at the horrific black blob slithering along Rita's body. The scream definitely was hurting the creature, and Naomi noticed. "It must hate noise," she shouted, and the two girls started screaming continuously. Rita was able to throw the creature to the floor. Their screaming had the creature writhing in pain as it became smaller and smaller. And just then Rita's parents burst in, and the dad yelled, "What the hell is going on?" The two girls stopped yelling for a minute, and the leechling seemed to regain its power. It leapt right at the dad and into his gaping mouth. "Mom, yell!" Rita screamed as Naomi and her started screaming again. The mum was frozen and stared in horror as the black creature was wriggling its way into the dad's throat. Finally, she managed to scream and joined the girls. The creature was losing and started to shrink and come back out of the dad's throat. The dad was choking but didn't seem to be able to pull the creature out. The paralysis must have been setting into him. When the creature was small enough, he finally took a deep breath and started screaming too. The leech was almost its normal size again, and Rita swatted it out of her dad's mouth, and Naomi promptly stomped on the creature, putting an end to it. After, no one moved for a long time, nor did they say anything. This time, there was no kanashibari, just horror and the realization of the frailty of life. At that point, Erina burst through the door and everyone shrieked in delight. "You're safe!" exclaimed Rita. "I'm too late. I came to warn you. Are you okay?" She started inching towards Rita. Rita was so relieved, but yet something didn't quite feel right. She started writhing in pain and her mouth swung open as if to scream, but nothing came out. Suddenly she frantically jerked and blood flew everywhere as her body violently turned itself inside out. They now stood before one of the leech monsters. Rita screamed again, but this time to no effect. Rita's father instinctively kicked at the leech creature and managed to boot it off balance and down the stairwell. It flayed around downstairs before slithering out of the open front door. Rita's father quickly followed it outside and wasted no time in grabbing the axe from his woodpile and swiftly hacked into it as it writhed around and shrieked at him in pain. He He continued to chop into it until he was satisfied that it would no longer be a threat. The girls came outside and stood around the bloody mess in complete shock. The leech slowly melted away into the soil, without a trace. It was over. A year had soon passed, and although they missed Erina, life had returned to normal. The strange phenomenon with the leeches was never fully explained, and it was quickly forgotten. The real tragedy here, though, is that even once we think an issue is resolved, under the surface lurks deeper and darker problems.
A huge thanks to all who support us through Patreon, and an extra special thanks to the Dark Cosmos, 5 Played Destiny, Christina, Patrick Lyke, and Richard Turlay.